Hey there, I'm Chroma, and welcome to part 8 of making an abstract adventure. Welcome back. This time we've made the other half of what we made the lineup arrows for, and now our Q character can shoot a projectile. So, similar to how our sphere could aim and then launch itself in any given direction, our Q character can now aim the arrow and then let go and shoot a projectile, which in this case is like a Shuriken ninja star sort of thing. At the moment it's just a black circle until we have better graphics in place, but for now this works just fine. And when it hits an object, any object, it'll get destroyed, and if it doesn't hit anything, once it goes off screen far enough, it'll be destroyed after about a second or so. As well, any shurikens that are spawned in get put in under this shuriken's parent object just for organization and all that. As well, when we actually shoot the projectile, we get a slight error boost, very minor. I might increase that at some point, but that was just, yeah, something else that exists. So, going into how this is being done, I guess. First, looking at the actual prefab for the Shuriken, it is basically just a circle sprite, as we've used for most of our graphics here, but then having a circle collider set to is trigger, so it'll actually go through things, that it's not like triggers and all that sort of stuff. It won't bounce off anything, basically, or we won't have other things bouncing off of it unintentionally. And then we have a rigid body where we have the linear drag actually set to 0, so that when we're moving it with forces, it won't be slowing down in midair. It'll just be going at a kind of constant speed for the most part. And then we have our actual Shuriken script, which has a speed and a lifetime variable. Then, over on our actual cube, we have another script called Square Shuriken Throw that has a throw delay, an air boost, power, I guess, and then the actual reference to the Shuriken prefab. So, now let's go over to the code and show how this is actually working. So, starting off with the Shuriken itself, we have the speed and lifetime variable here, as well as a private reference to the rigid body. Now, in its start frame, which, unlike most of the cases where we've used start in the past, it's not going to be running right as the game starts. This will be running on the first frame of the object being spawned in, so it'll run the start function right when the object exists. So when that happens, we get a reference to its rigid body, and then as well add this impulse force using the rigid body, so it'll start moving in its given direction. Whoa. At the moment, this is set to transform.up times speed, and it's done as an impulse force, so it's instantaneous and all that. Transform.up, that's going to be the up relative direction of the object, and then the actual rotation of which way it's facing will be dependent on the throw script that actually determines its rotation based on the arrow. And then we have this destroy function here, which doesn't destroy it right away despite it being in the start function, having this first parameter being the game object itself that is getting destroyed, and then this lifetime second parameter, which is the variable that we made up here, that's adding a delay of sorts to how long until the object destroys itself. So as soon as it spawns, we're starting the timer of about a second until it gets destroyed, if nothing else destroys it from it colliding with something else. Then, down here, on this on-trigger enter part here, we're basically then just testing if it's collided with anything on the environment later to start. Eventually we might add, when we have more layers of if enemies and hazards are on their own layer, we'll add these in here. But for now, the only layers that matter are just environment layers. So yeah, we're testing if it's collided with anything on that is part of the environment, basically, and then destroying it if that's the case. And then I imagine if we have like hazards and all that, it would destroy maybe the hazard as well, or run a script upon an enemy to have it deal damage and all that. So yeah, that's how that's running. Now over on how the shot is actually being thrown, first of all, on the square main, adding a reference to this script up here for the square Shuriken throw, and then getting its reference and running a function that we'll be looking at in a second that's running in this script's update frame. I keep saying update every frame of the game where update is running. So lastly, on the actual script that's allowing us to throw the Shuriken, first we have these three variables as we saw in the inspector for throw delay, the air boost power, and then the reference to the Shuriken itself. Then a bunch of private variables for references to the player lineup script, the player ground check script, or as we'll see down here, for testing whether or not we're grounded, for whether or not we apply that air boost, because we're not going to apply it if we're on the ground. And then a reference to the rigid body and the parent that we're using to store the Shurikens under for organization in the hierarchy. Next, in the awake function, we're just getting all of these references with a bunch of get components here, and then here using GameObject.find, then just the name of the object to get that reference, and because it's a transform, we're then adding .transform at the end, because normally this would return the game object. So then we're getting that reference there. Then the function here we were just looking at over at the square main that actually is running every update. We're first testing if on the player lineup script, if the release variable is true, more or less in the same way that we did with the lunge slash. And then if it is, then we're starting this coroutine right below it called wait to throw, which again, a lot of similarities to this and the circle lunge slash. So then down here, we're setting the released and can aim booleans to false. Then we're instantiating the actual Shuriken with this being the reference to the Shuriken prefab. Then we're spawning it where the player is, and then the rotation is being determined on the arrow's rotation. And then a last parameter here for what will be its parent, so what object is being like childed under. So just again, for organization, if you're trying to be super efficient, I guess it's not technically necessary, but it just makes the editor look a bit nicer there. And then first testing whether or not we're grounded to see if we need to apply the air boost, and then we're also setting the rigid body's velocity to 0 if we're not grounded and are going to apply the air boost, so that it's more consistent depending on our speed going up, down, whatever. And then actually applying that force that is again an impulse force for everything like jumping and everything that's kind of like an explosion force, more or less. Then we're waiting a small delay before we can shoot again, and then setting this variable to true. And in a nutshell, that's basically it. So yeah, a lot of similarities between the throwing the Shuriken and the sphere's lunge slash thing. But yeah, it's not a lot of difference, so not a lot to explain there. So then that's basically it for this video. Next, we're going to be sort of doing a back and forth, I guess, working on another sphere ability and then another cube ability, and they'll start to be more so different now, I think, because the sphere is going to have like a bounce and this like shield reflect thing, and the cube is going to have, I believe, a crouch that's going to have a lot more context specific programming to it, of crouching near certain objects will trigger certain events like hiding behind stuff or stuff like that we might not program all of just yet. We'll wait till we actually start making the objects that ability interacts with. Same thing with the shield, with things that it might reflect. That functionality won't necessarily be made yet until we start actually making the things to be reflected, I guess. And then also sticking to walls. That one should be easy enough. I believe it should just be messing with the gravity or setting the rigid body is kinematic or something like that. But as well, something I realized I hadn't actually explained is this environment down here. I kind of changed it, and that was basically just done through having a bunch of cubes that were rotated, and they kind of overlap in a way that has this sort of effect. And these ones on top are all in the foreground, so the cube actually goes behind them, just to add more detail in the foreground and background. But this is just kind of messing around with different potential art style type things when we're working on stuff past the demo. I imagine a lot of this will be done in like Photoshop as one big image, maybe. That sort of stuff I'll have to work out as we get to that later on. But yeah, that's how that's done. One last thing I'd like to mention with the Shurikens themselves is them being spawned in and destroyed is done through the instantiate function and the destroy function. Now, usually, if you look up advanced programming techniques or whatever, it'll be recommended not to use stuff like that mid-gameplay, generally. But for this case, another potential way we could have gone about spawning and using these projectiles is with our parent here, having a bunch of Shuriken game objects as child objects already in the scene, and then just have them disabled and stored somewhere else, and then every time we need to spawn in one of them, we just kind of move it into position and then turn it on, basically, and then when it hits something, it gets destroyed, we just like turn it off and move it back to somewhere off screen and disable it, and then sort of just go down the list and go back up. This is something called an object pool. Now, that can be something useful if you are spawning and destroying in a lot of objects at once, or just having a lot of objects on screen. Like maybe in like a top-down shooter type of game, that might be useful. But for this case, because there's only ever really like 2 Shurikens on screen or like in the game at any given time, they're not really spawned that frequently. I think that it's perfectly fine to just instantiate and destroy them, especially because this game is going to be simple enough anyways, even like art style wise. There shouldn't really be any performance issues in that regard. And then if there is, then that's something we can look into for like optimization and all that. But for this case, because I don't really think it's a scenario that requires it, we're not going to worry about that for now. But if we get to a scenario where we're spawning in a bunch of per certain projectile or whatever, then we might look into making an object pool. But for now, I'm kind of repeating myself, so yeah, that should work just fine for these purposes. But anyways, that'll do it for this episode then. So thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you around.